You never see it coming when the shift begins. That is the unsettling part. For so long the dynamic felt predictable. They pulled away. You leaned in. They went silent. You tried harder. They withheld affection. You over-delivered understanding. It became a rhythm, painful, yes, but familiar. And familiarity can feel like safety, even when it is slowly draining you. In avoidant psychology, distance is power. Withdrawal is control. Silence is leverage. And for a long time, they believed they held all three. An avoidant does not always look cold. Sometimes they look composed, independent, self-contained. They pride themselves on not needing anyone. They convince themselves that emotional intensity is weakness and vulnerability is a liability. So when someone comes along who feels deeply, loves openly, and expresses their needs honestly, it unsettles them. Not because they do not feel, but because they feel more than they want to admit. You sense that depth in them, that hidden softness behind the walls, that unspoken fear behind the independence. And because you are a super empath, not just sensitive, but perceptive, you did not judge it. You leaned closer. You tried to show them that love does not have to feel threatening. You believed patience would soften them. You believed consistency would calm them. You believed your warmth could melt their distance. But what you did not realize was that your chasing, your reassuring, your overfunctioning was quietly feeding their sense of control. Every time you texted first after they disappeared, every time you apologized just to restore peace, every time you accepted breadcrumbs and called it hope, you reinforced the pattern. You became the emotional regulator for both of you, and they grew comfortable in that imbalance. Avoidant psychology thrives on asymmetry. As long as you are the one reaching, they can stay in retreat. As long as you are the one clarifying, they can stay ambiguous. As long as you are the one afraid to lose them, they never have to confront the fear of losing you. And then something inside you shifted. It did not happen overnight. It was not dramatic. There was no explosive argument, no grand declaration. It was quieter than that. It was the exhaustion that comes from pouring into someone who keeps stepping back. It was the realization that love should not feel like negotiation. It was the moment you saw the pattern clearly, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That is when the power dynamic began to change. An avoidant feels powerful when they are pursued. They feel validated when someone tolerates their inconsistency. They feel secure when the other person is more afraid of abandonment than they are. But when the pursuit stops, when the energy shifts, when the super empath withdraws without bitterness or blame, something destabilizes inside them. Because now, for the first time, they are not in control of the distance. What makes a super empath different is not just their capacity to love, it is their capacity to awaken. A regular empath may continue giving even when it hurts. A super empath eventually recognizes the imbalance and recalibrates. They do not shut down their heart, they refine it. They do not become cold, they become clear. And clarity is what avoidants fear most. You stopped over-explaining yourself. You stopped justifying your needs. You stopped trying to decode their mixed signals. You responded instead of reacting. You observed instead of chasing. And the silence that once terrified you began to feel like space. Space to breathe, to think, to remember who you were before you started shrinking yourself to fit into their comfort zone. At first, they may not have noticed. Avoidants are skilled at emotional compartmentalization. They convince themselves they prefer distance. They tell themselves that less intensity equals less risk. But underneath that surface logic is a nervous system wired for defense. When the usual validation is removed, when the expected reassurance does not arrive, their calm exterior begins to crack. Because suddenly, the push-pull cycle is interrupted. For so long, the dynamic ran like clockwork. They pulled away. You leaned forward. They delayed responses. You increased effort. They expressed uncertainty. You offered certainty. It created a loop of tension and relief that felt addictive. The push created anxiety. The pull created hope. And that oscillation bonded you in ways that felt profound, but were actually rooted in imbalance. The super empath eventually sees that chasing does not create closeness, it creates dependency. And dependency is not love, it is fear disguised as devotion. So you stopped feeding the cycle. You did not send the follow-up message. You did not ask if they were okay after they went quiet. You did not bend your boundaries to keep the connection alive. You chose stillness over striving, and in that stillness, something remarkable happened. You began to feel your own strength again. Avoidants are often misunderstood. They are not villains. They are individuals who learned early that vulnerability was unsafe, so they built armor. They mastered emotional self-sufficiency. They equated independence with survival. But when someone loves them deeply, it activates the very fears they buried. Fear of engulfment, fear of inadequacy, fear of being truly seen. When you were chasing them, they could blame you for the intensity. They could tell themselves you were too much. But when you became grounded, when you regulated your own emotions and stopped demanding reassurance, they lost that narrative. Now they had to face their own discomfort without projecting it onto you. And that is the harsh lesson. It is not harsh because it is cruel. It is harsh because it is honest. The super empath's withdrawal is not revenge. It is alignment. It says, I will not abandon myself to keep you comfortable. And for someone used to being the one who controls proximity, that boundary feels destabilizing. Silence becomes louder. Distance feels different. The absence of your pursuit becomes presence, a mirror reflecting back their own detachment. You may wonder if they notice. They do. Maybe not immediately, maybe not consciously, but the nervous system notices when a pattern shifts. The ego notices when validation decreases. The heart notices when warmth recedes. And this is where the internal conflict begins. Avoidants often experience relief when someone gives them space. But when that space is no longer temporary, when it carries the energy of finality rather than strategy, relief turns into unease. Because now there is a possibility they did not anticipate, losing someone who truly saw them. You were not just another admirer. You were not impressed by surface charm alone. You saw the wounded parts. You sensed the guardedness. You understood the fear beneath the cool exterior, and you loved them anyway. That kind of love is rare. When the super empath stops overgiving, it is not because they stopped caring, it is because they started caring about themselves, and that shift is seismic. The avoidant may try to maintain composure, they may tell themselves you were replaceable, they may distract themselves with work, friends, or superficial connections, but unresolved emotional tension does not disappear, it lingers. Because what unsettles them is not just your absence, it is the loss of control. Control was the safety net. Control kept intimacy at bay. Control ensured that if things became too vulnerable, they could retreat and you would follow. But now, when they step back, you do not chase. When they go silent, you do not panic. When they test the waters with minimal effort, you do not overcompensate. And suddenly, the dynamic is equal. Equality feels foreign to someone accustomed to holding emotional leverage. It requires participation. It requires initiative. It requires risk. The super empath taught them something they will never forget, that love cannot be sustained by imbalance, that emotional unavailability does not make someone powerful, that silence is only effective when the other person fears it, and you no longer fear it. There is a quiet dignity in detachment. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply shifts energy inward. You begin investing in your own growth. You reconnect with passions you neglected. You strengthen friendships you sidelined. You reclaim time, attention, and emotional bandwidth. And in doing so, you transform. The harshness of the lesson lies in its simplicity. You cannot keep someone who refuses to meet you halfway. And once you internalize that truth, your behavior changes naturally. You stop auditioning for love. You stop trying to prove your worth. You stop mistaking potential for reality. Avoidants often underestimate the super empath. They interpret kindness as weakness. They assume patience means permanence. They mistake understanding for tolerance without limits. But when the empath evolves, when empathy is paired with boundaries, it becomes formidable. Because now, love is offered, not chased. Presence is given, not begged for. And if it is not reciprocated, it is withdrawn without hostility. That is the moment they realize something has shifted permanently. You did not explode. You did not insult. You did not demand. You simply stepped back into yourself, and that calm withdrawal is more impactful than any argument could have been. They may replay conversations in their mind. They may wonder when exactly you stopped reacting. They may test small openings to see if the old dynamic can be revived. But the energy has changed. You are no longer operating from fear of loss. You are operating from self-respect. And self-respect is magnetic, not because it seeks attention, but because it does not need it. The first 5 sections of this journey are not about punishing someone. They are about awakening. They are about recognizing the pattern of avoidant psychology, understanding how the push-pull cycle drains both people, and reclaiming emotional sovereignty. You loved deeply. That was never the mistake. The mistake was believing you had to earn consistency. Now you understand something profound. The one who detaches with grace teaches the most powerful lesson of all. Not through words, not through confrontation, but through absence that speaks louder than pursuit ever could. And once that lesson is learned by both of you, nothing will ever feel the same again. And once that lesson is learned by both of you, nothing will ever feel the same again. Because the moment you detach with clarity, something unexpected happens inside them. At first, they try to rationalize it. They tell themselves you are just busy. They assume you will circle back the way you always have. They expect the familiar rhythm to resume, the subtle withdrawal followed by your gentle return. But when hours turn into days, and days turn into silence without pursuit, a quiet discomfort begins to surface. This is where the ego wound forms. Avoidants are not immune to attachment. They simply manage it differently. They suppress, compartmentalize, and downplay. But when the usual validation source goes quiet, the ego registers it as a disruption. Not because they consciously crave attention, but because consistency from you had become a stabilizer. You were the emotional constant they did not have to fight for. And now, that constant is gone. They may not admit it. They may not reach out immediately, but internally something is unsettled. The mind starts replaying moments, the way you looked at them when they spoke, the patience you offered during their distance, the understanding that required no explanation. These memories begin to resurface, not because they want them to, but because unresolved emotion seeks closure. The harsh lesson is not loud, it is quiet reflection. For the first time, they are not distracted by your effort. There is no incoming reassurance to buffer their discomfort, no gentle message softening the space, no emotional cushion absorbing their withdrawal. What remains is their own internal experience, raw and unfiltered, and that can feel overwhelming. Avoidants often pride themselves on self-sufficiency, but self-sufficiency is not the same as emotional independence. True independence allows connection without fear. Defensive independence avoids connection to prevent vulnerability. And when someone like you steps back, it exposes that difference. They begin to feel something they have avoided for years: accountability. Accountability for mixed signals, accountability for inconsistency, accountability for taking warmth for granted. When you were over-functioning, it was easy to believe the relationship was balanced enough. Your effort compensated for their hesitation. Your empathy softened their avoidance. But when you stopped compensating, the imbalance became visible, and visibility can be uncomfortable. You, on the other hand, are undergoing a different transformation. In the quiet of your detachment, you start noticing how much energy you were pouring outward. You remember the anxiety that used to rise when they delayed a response, the way your thoughts would spiral, searching for reassurance, the subtle shrinking of your own needs to keep peace. And as you observe it without judgment, you feel something shift, not anger, but awareness. Awareness is powerful because it dissolves illusion. You realize that love should not require constant interpretation. You realize that if someone values you, their actions will not leave you guessing. You realize that your depth deserves reciprocity, not tolerance. This is emotional maturity in motion. Instead of reacting impulsively to their silence, you respond intentionally to your own needs. Instead of chasing clarity from them, you create clarity within yourself, and that inner grounding radiates outward. Even if you do not speak to them, they feel the difference. Because energy shifts before words do. They may sense your detachment through subtle changes. The tone of your responses becomes neutral rather than eager. The frequency of your outreach decreases, the urgency is gone, and what replaces it is calm. Calm can be more destabilizing than anger. Anger signals engagement. It shows you still care enough to react. But calm detachment signals resolution. It suggests that you are no longer emotionally entangled in the same way, and that realization can trigger an internal conflict they did not anticipate. Relief and panic begin to coexist. Part of them feels relief, less emotional pressure, less intensity, less perceived expectation. But another part feels something else entirely, the possibility of loss. And loss, especially when it involves someone who truly understood them, is not easy to ignore. They may start checking your activity, wondering what you are doing, imagining who you are with, not because they are possessive, but because the absence of your consistent attention creates a void, and humans are wired to notice when something familiar disappears. This is where scarcity psychology quietly enters the picture. When something is always available, it can be unconsciously undervalued, not intentionally, just habitually. But when that availability shifts, the mind reclassifies it as significant. Your time, your emotional presence, your steady reassurance, once assumed, now feel uncertain. Uncertainty heightens awareness, and awareness amplifies emotion. They might not immediately reach out with vulnerability. Avoidants rarely move that way. Instead, they may test the waters indirectly, a casual message, a neutral check-in, a subtle attempt to re-establish connection without acknowledging the shift. They want to see if the old dynamic is still accessible, but you are no longer operating from the same emotional script. You respond, but you do not overinvest. You engage, but you do not overextend. You are warm yet boundaried, present yet self-contained, and that balance forces them to confront something unfamiliar: reciprocity. Reciprocity requires effort. It requires stepping forward rather than stepping back. It requires expressing rather than suppressing. And for someone accustomed to controlling distance, that step can feel vulnerable. This is the internal struggle of the avoidant. When the super empath evolves, they begin questioning themselves. Was I too distant? Did I misjudge their strength? Why does this feel different? Why do I feel this pull now that they are not pulling me? Because the push-pull cycle has collapsed. Without your pursuit, there is no tension to regulate. Without your overgiving, there is no imbalance to lean on. What remains is the possibility of genuine connection, which is both what they crave and what they fear. And that contradiction creates restlessness. Meanwhile, you are experiencing something new: peace. Not the anxious hope that comes from intermittent reinforcement, not the temporary relief after they reappear, but steady peace rooted in self-respect. You begin sleeping better, thinking clearer, investing in yourself more fully. The emotional bandwidth once consumed by deciphering their behavior is now available for your own growth. This is the awakening of the super empath. You recognize that your empathy is not a tool to fix others. It is a strength to share with those who honor it. You understand that understanding someone's wounds does not obligate you to endure their defense mechanisms. Compassion does not require self-sacrifice. And as this realization solidifies, your energy becomes secure. Security is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply stands firm. It does not chase. It does not plead. It does not negotiate basic respect. And because security is rare, it is deeply impactful. The avoidant begins to feel the weight of what they may have lost. Not just a partner, not just attention, but someone who saw through their defenses without trying to control them. Someone who offered closeness without suffocation. Someone who balanced depth with patience. And now, that presence is no longer guaranteed. This is the lesson that lingers. They may attempt to reconnect more intentionally. They may soften their tone. They may express curiosity about your life. And for the first time, they might initiate more consistently. But even if they do, the dynamic has already shifted inside you. You are no longer seeking validation from their effort. You are observing alignment. If they step forward authentically, you can meet them. If they retreat again, you do not collapse, because your stability is no longer dependent on their behavior. That is growth. And growth is irreversible. The harsh lesson they will never forget is not that you left, it is that you stayed grounded. You did not manipulate, you did not threaten, you simply removed yourself from imbalance. And that removal forced reflection. For some avoidants, that reflection becomes transformation. They begin confronting their patterns. They explore why intimacy feels threatening. They question the armor they have worn for so long, because losing someone who offered safe connection can become a catalyst. For others, the lesson becomes a quiet regret. They may move on outwardly, they may distract themselves, but somewhere in their memory there will be the awareness that someone once loved them without trying to control them, and that they allowed fear to override possibility. And that awareness does not fade easily. As for you, the super empath, the transformation continues. You are no longer attracted to potential alone. You look for consistency. You value mutual effort. You recognize red flags sooner. You trust your intuition more deeply. And perhaps most importantly, you understand that walking away from imbalance is not failure, it is self-alignment. You did not lose them. You lost the version of yourself that tolerated less than you deserved. And in doing so, you taught them something profound. That love cannot be maintained by distance alone, that silence has consequences, that emotional availability matters, that empathy paired with boundaries is unshakable. The dynamic may never return to what it was, and that is the point, because what it was required you to shrink, what it becomes, if it becomes anything at all, will require equality. And equality begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable. This is where the story deepens, not in revenge, not in proving a point, but in transformation, theirs if they choose it, yours because you already have. And equality begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable. That is the turning point most people never talk about. Because when you finally stand in your own emotional sovereignty, you realize something that changes everything. You were never asking for too much, you were asking the wrong person. That realization is both liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating because it releases you from self-doubt. Heartbreaking because you see how long you tried to shrink your needs to fit into someone else's limitations. You replay moments in your mind, the times you convinced yourself to be patient just a little longer, understanding just a little deeper, forgiving just one more inconsistency. You weren't weak, you were hopeful, but hope without reciprocity becomes self-abandonment. And now, that version of you is gone. The avoidant feels it more than they admit. They may not articulate it in emotional language, they may not confess vulnerability openly, but internally, something is undeniable. Your energy is no longer orbiting around them. And for someone who subconsciously relied on that orbit, the silence becomes louder by the day. This is where the delayed emotional processing begins. Avoidants often suppress feelings in the moment. When conflict arises, they detach. When intensity builds, they withdraw. But emotions that are postponed do not disappear. They resurface later, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, when the distraction fades and the absence becomes real. And when it hits differently. They start remembering the warmth you brought into their life, the stability, the softness, the way you tried to understand rather than accuse, the way you gave them space without punishment, the way you believed in their potential even when they doubted themselves. It wasn't just attention they lost, it was safety. And safety is not easily replaced. You, meanwhile, are stepping into a new level of awareness. You begin recognizing how attachment styles shape behavior. You understand that avoidant patterns are rooted in fear, not malice, but understanding no longer translates into tolerance. Because growth means compassion with boundaries. You no longer internalize their distance as a reflection of your worth. You see it as a reflection of their wiring, and that clarity removes the emotional sting. When you stop personalizing their withdrawal, you stop chasing their approval. And that is where your power solidifies. There is a profound difference between reacting and responding. Reacting comes from wounds, responding comes from awareness. In the past, their silence triggered anxiety. Now it triggers observation. You notice your feelings without letting them dictate your actions. That emotional regulation is transformative, because now, even if they return, even if they attempt to reconnect, you are no longer driven by urgency, you are driven by alignment. Alignment asks one simple question: does this feel mutual? If the answer is no, you no longer negotiate with yourself. This is the lesson that reshapes your identity. For so long, you defined love as endurance. You believed loyalty meant staying through inconsistency. You thought understanding someone's trauma meant excusing their behavior. But now you see that healthy love does not require constant emotional labor. Healthy love feels safe, safe enough to express needs, safe enough to ask questions, safe enough to trust consistency. And if someone cannot provide that safety, you do not attempt to convince them, you release them. Release is not rejection, it is recognition. Recognition that you deserve reciprocity. The avoidant, on the other hand, begins to feel something unfamiliar, vulnerability without control. When you were chasing, they could predict the outcome. When you were explaining, they could remain passive. But now, if they want connection, they must initiate. If they want closeness, they must risk expression. If they want you back in their orbit, they must meet you halfway. And halfway requires exposure. Exposure means admitting they care. Exposure means acknowledging they may have mismanaged something valuable. Exposure means confronting the fear of intimacy instead of hiding behind independence. For someone wired to equate vulnerability with danger, this is terrifying. But it is also necessary. Some avoidants rise to this challenge. They begin reflecting deeply. They notice patterns in previous relationships, how partners often left feeling unseen or unfulfilled. They recognize the common denominator. They begin questioning whether their protective mechanisms are costing them meaningful connection. And if they are willing to sit with that discomfort, transformation begins. Not because you forced it, but because your detachment revealed it. Your absence became a mirror that reflected not their flaws but their avoidance. And mirrors are hard to ignore. Others may not choose growth. They may cling to their defenses. They may tell themselves you were too intense, too emotional, too demanding. They may seek partners who require less vulnerability. But even in that narrative, your impact remains, because deep down, they know you were different. You did not demand perfection. You asked for presence. You did not require constant attention. You asked for consistency. You did not seek control. You sought connection. And that distinction lingers. You taught them that emotional unavailability does not protect them from loss. In fact, it often creates it. And that lesson embeds itself quietly in their memory. Meanwhile, your transformation continues expanding. You begin noticing the difference between chemistry and compatibility. Chemistry feels intense, magnetic, consuming. Compatibility feels stable, grounded, peaceful. In the past, the push-pull dynamic created chemistry that felt intoxicating. Now you crave something steadier. You crave reciprocity without games. You crave communication without decoding. You crave affection without withdrawal. And most importantly, you crave a love where you do not have to shrink to sustain it. That clarity changes who you attract. Because when you operate from security, you naturally filter out inconsistency. You recognize early signs of emotional unavailability. You do not interpret distance as mystery. You interpret it as information, and information guides your choices. The super empath does not lose their depth. They refine it. They channel it toward people who meet them with equal intention. They stop investing in potential and start investing in patterns. Patterns reveal truth, and the truth is simple. Love thrives where effort is mutual. The harsh lesson they will never forget is not about punishment, it is about contrast. You showed them what secure energy feels like. Even if you were not fully secure yet, you demonstrated patience without pressure. You offered closeness without control. And when you removed that offering, the contrast became undeniable. They may compare future connections to you. They may notice when someone lacks your emotional intelligence. They may miss the calm way you handled conflict. They may realize that not everyone is willing to understand without judgment. And in those moments, your memory resurfaces, not as bitterness, but as realization. You were not asking for too much. You were offering something rare, and now you offer it selectively. There is a quiet strength in knowing you can love deeply without losing yourself. That is the evolution of the super empath. You no longer equate intensity with intimacy. You no longer interpret inconsistency as depth. You no longer chase clarity from someone unwilling to give it. You become the clarity, and clarity attracts differently. This phase of the journey is less about them and more about you. It is about integrating the lesson fully. It is about forgiving yourself for the times you tolerated less. It is about honoring the version of you who tried so hard, because that effort came from love, not weakness. But growth means you do not stay there. You move forward lighter. You carry empathy, but you pair it with standards. You remain open, but you maintain boundaries. You stay warm, but you refuse to overextend. And that balance is powerful. The avoidant may eventually understand the magnitude of what happened. They may realize that losing someone who loved them with patience was not trivial. They may even attempt to reconnect with greater awareness. If they do, you will recognize whether the change is genuine or temporary. Because now you trust your intuition more than your longing. And that trust is everything. The super empath's lesson is not dramatic, it is transformative. It teaches that love without boundaries becomes depletion. That detachment can be compassionate, that walking away can be the most loving act for both people. You did not teach them through confrontation. You taught them through evolution. And evolution cannot be undone. And evolution cannot be undone. Once you have tasted self-respect, you cannot go back to self-abandonment without feeling the cost of it in your body. That is the part people don't prepare you for. When the super empath awakens, it is not just a mindset shift, it is a nervous system shift. The anxiety that once surged when they pulled away now feels foreign. The urge to fix, to explain, to reach, it still flickers sometimes, but it no longer controls you. You pause, you breathe, you choose yourself. And in that pause you feel something steady forming inside you. This is secure energy being built in real time. Not because someone rescued you, not because they suddenly changed, but because you decided that your emotional stability was not up for negotiation anymore. The avoidant feels this final shift differently than the earlier ones. Before, they sensed your distance as reaction. Now they sense it as resolution. There is a finality in resolution that unsettles them. When someone reacts, there is still emotion to work with. There is still volatility, still engagement. But when someone resolves internally, they detach without chaos. They do not slam doors, they quietly close them. And that quiet closing echoes. The avoidant begins to understand that the connection they once took for granted is no longer accessible in the same way. The dynamic cannot be revived by minimal effort. The old version of you, the one who overextended, overexplained, overcompensated, is no longer available. And that realization can feel like standing outside a door that no longer opens automatically. For some avoidants, this is the moment regret fully crystallizes. They may replay specific memories with new awareness, the time you asked for reassurance and they dismissed it, the moment you tried to communicate calmly and they shut down, the subtle ways they minimized your emotional needs because confronting them felt uncomfortable. Memory becomes heavier when perspective changes. They may finally feel what you once felt, the ache of distance, the confusion of silence, the uncertainty of mixed signals, not because you inflicted it, but because the absence of your pursuit forces them to sit in their own behavior. And that sitting can be transformative. But here is the deeper truth: whether they transform or not is no longer your responsibility. That realization is the final liberation. For so long, part of you believed that if you just loved correctly, softly enough, patiently enough, intelligently enough, you could help them feel safe. You carried hope like a mission. You thought your empathy could bridge the gap between their fear and your connection. But now you understand something profound. You can invite someone into emotional safety. You cannot drag them there. And once you release that burden, your shoulders feel lighter. The super empath does not lose compassion in this stage, they deepen it. But their compassion includes themselves now. They speak to themselves differently. They no longer say, maybe I was too much. They say, maybe I was simply too much for someone who was not ready. That reframing changes everything, because you stop questioning your depth. You stop apologizing for needing consistency. You stop shrinking your emotional intelligence to match someone else's avoidance. And when you stop shrinking, you expand. Expansion attracts differently. You start meeting people who respond rather than retreat, who communicate rather than disappear, who lean in rather than lean back. And at first it may feel unfamiliar, almost boring compared to the intensity of push-pull. But then you realize something. Peace is not boring. Peace is safe, and safe love does not require constant adrenaline. The avoidant may sense this shift from afar. They may notice that you are no longer available in the same way, that your energy feels grounded, self-contained, unshaken, and sometimes that groundedness becomes the very thing that finally draws them toward growth. Because secure energy is magnetic. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. And steadiness exposes instability. They may reach out again, this time softer, more intentional, perhaps even vulnerable in ways they were not before. And if they do, you will not react with the old urgency. You will observe. You will listen for consistency. You will watch for alignment. Because now you understand that words without behavioral change are just comfort attempts. Real change shows up repeatedly. If they demonstrate growth, you may choose to explore it. But you will not abandon your boundaries to make it work. And if they do not, you will not collapse. Because your identity is no longer tied to saving potential. This is the final lesson you teach them. That love is a privilege, not an entitlement. That emotional availability is required, not optional. That empathy is powerful, but only when paired with standards. They will never forget the moment you stopped chasing, not because it hurt their ego alone, but because it forced them to confront themselves, and self-confrontation leaves a mark. You see, when someone who loves deeply withdraws with grace, it disrupts illusions. It removes the comfort of imbalance. It highlights what was taken for granted. It invites reflection, and reflection is uncomfortable. But discomfort is the birthplace of awareness. Whether they use that awareness to grow is up to them. You have already grown. You no longer romanticize inconsistency. You no longer interpret distance as mystery. You no longer accept breadcrumbs and call them effort. You recognize that healthy love feels mutual from the beginning, and that recognition protects you. There is a quiet confidence that forms in this stage. You walk differently. You speak differently. You carry yourself with an internal certainty that says, I will not beg for what should be given freely. That certainty radiates. The super empath does not become hardened. They become discerning. Discerning enough to know when someone is emotionally available. Discerning enough to step back early when red flags appear. Discerning enough to value their own peace more than temporary validation. And that discernment is wisdom earned through experience. The avoidant may remember you years later, not as the one who chased, but as the one who walked away calmly, not as the one who demanded, but as the one who required mutuality, not as the one who tried to change them, but as the one who changed themselves. That memory will linger because it contrasts with their usual patterns. It challenges their narrative. It disrupts their comfort. You became the relationship that held up a mirror, and mirrors do not lie. In the end, the harsh lesson was not about punishment or pride. It was about alignment. You aligned with your worth. You aligned with reciprocity. You aligned with secure energy. And once aligned, you refused to step out of it. That refusal is not stubbornness. It is self-respect. The super empath's power was never in chasing, it was in choosing. Choosing when to give. Choosing when to step back. Choosing when to stay. Choosing when to leave. And in choosing yourself, you taught them something they will never forget. Forget that love cannot survive where effort is one-sided. That silence has consequences. That empathy is not weakness. That the one who detaches with grace holds the real strength. And as you continue forward, you carry this lesson not as bitterness, but as wisdom. You are no longer trying to be enough for someone who withholds. You are becoming aligned for someone who matches. That is the completion of this chapter, not an ending fueled by resentment, but a transformation grounded in awareness. And once awareness awakens, nothing, not distance, not silence, not avoidance, can ever return you to who you were before.